Again, thank you for joining us tonight. So glad to have ADA members from across the country, as well as friends from the Perkins Center who are joining us this evening. Thank you. We're delighted to be joined by journalist and author Kirstin Downey as well. But before we get into the discussion with Kirstin about Frances Perkins and the New Deal, I want to say happy birthday to ADA. It's 75 years today. A group of dedicated liberals gathered at the Willard Hotel in Washington, D.C., unlike the anti-democratic cabal that apparently gathered there a year ago, attempting to overthrow American democracy. The ADAs gathered to form a group to save and expand the New Deal and engage the public and public officials in action for progressive change. Among them were luminaries such as former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, labor icons Walter Reuther and David Dubinsky, legendary economist John Kenneth Galbraith, theologian Ronald Niebuhr, and the young mayor of Minneapolis and eventual senator and vice president Hubert Humphrey, among many other notable activists and intellectuals of the time. Thanks to our executive committee chair, Kurt Meyer, found this note from ADA founder Eleanor Roosevelt, which she noted in her My Day column in the days following that meeting. And I quote, "I spent the whole day yesterday from 9:30 in the morning till after 5 in the afternoon with a group of people, many of whom have known before, who were trying to set up a liberal and progressive organization. They chose as their name, Americans United for Democratic Action. If they live up to that name, they will not only lay down certain principles, but they will find ways and means to acquaint the people of the country with their program. In addition, they will organize the action which can be taken in any community in the nation if people are in agreement on specific programs. I'm joining with other progressives, many of whom are far younger and more active than I am and far more influential, in an attempt to carry on the spirit of progress." 75 years later, with countless legislative and electoral battles marked by both stinging defeat and glorious success under our collective belts, ADA marches on. Thanks to all of you for being a part of ADA today. As we embark on our 75th year, we will honor our history, but work hard with you on our future as we know, even in the difficult times, the best is yet to come. Now to our author and the subject matter. Kirstin Downey is a journalist and author. Her youth was often filled with moving from place to place with her family, including places such as Hawaii and the Panama Canal Zone, where along the way she gained a global perspective on life, trade, and economics. And after studying journalism at Penn State, she began a career in journalism that included stops in Florida, Colorado, California, and then with the Washington Post. And it was through her work and research on workplace issues that Kirstin was led to learn more about and ultimately write about Frances Perkins. Her book, The Woman Behind the New Deal, is our topic tonight on the 75th anniversary of ADA's founding, which was sparked by the desire to protect and expand on New Deal ideals. Kirstin, thank you, and the mic is yours.
Thank you so much, and I hope everyone can see me here. Happy New Year, everybody. In honor of the New Deal, I'm in front of a fire, a roaring fire here. If it catches fire behind me, please begin waving your arms wildly so I can evacuate from one of the different exits, because Frances Perkins was always big on having a fire exit plan after she witnessed the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. But nevertheless, I thought in honor of FDR, we'd have a little bit of a fire here, and I'd have a little bit of a drink. It isn't the drink that Frances Perkins would have had. She would have had bourbon and branch water. I'm having a gin and tonic, but it's the idea of it. I'm delighted to be here tonight, to talk about the fabulous and remarkable life of Frances Perkins. When I set out to write a biography of Frances Perkins, I knew she was one of the most important American women in history. And by the time I was done with the book and done with my research, I came to believe that she was the most important, most effective, progressive, either man or woman in American history. There's really no one else who can claim credit for so many different parts of our Social Security safety net, but now our safety net, which has proven itself so extraordinarily valuable in just the last 2 years, when we had, some 60 million people, as COVID hit, And as we entered a lockdown, we had some 68 million people on Social Security. And at the peak, about 23 million were on unemployment insurance. Extraordinary when you think, so in other words, more than, about 100 million people last year were dependent on Frances Perkins for their livelihoods, for keeping a roof over their head and food. It's an extraordinary record. And I'd also like to note, in such a time that's so fractured politically, that when we began to craft, when the country started to craft a reaction to this terrible new epidemic that was confronting us last year, what was remarkable is how building payments to people on the unemployment insurance system happened with almost complete political unanimity. This was extraordinary, and it even called for an expansion of unemployment insurance to cover a group of people that had been uncovered for a long time, which was independent contractors. So Frances Perkins' handiwork has come amazingly to the core of our culture in the past 2 years, and in many ways with very unanimous success, which we know how really unusual it is. I want to, there are some here, some of you whose faces I can see, I know already, and I know that you're very well aware of Frances Perkins. And so, but there are many among us, and some will be joining us, who don't know who she is. And so I thought I would start this by reading to you from the prologue of my book, because it gives you an introduction to all the things that she did. It doesn't touch everything, for example, her work on improving maternal survival rates and protecting babies from infant mortality. Her work on fire safety, I'm not really going to be discussing that too much tonight. This is really what she did during the New Deal. But still, it's so much in itself that it's almost more than we can take in. And it's an extraordinary record of accomplishment. But let me start by setting the scene for you. Then I'll talk a little bit more about some of the other things she did. I want to leave time for some questions and answers, and I'm sure a lot of you will have questions. And I want to make a suggestion for a thing that we can all do to celebrate the New Deal this year, in this year of the 75th anniversary, something that can bring us all joy. And so I'd like to talk about that towards the end of our session. So please don't let me forget that. But I'm going to start reading now. The book is called The Woman Behind the New Deal. On a chilly February night in 1933, a middle-aged woman waited expectantly to meet with her employer at his residence on East 65th Street in New York City. She clutched a scrap of paper with hastily written notes. Finally ushered into his study, the woman brushed aside her nervousness and spoke confidently. They bantered casually for a while, as was their style. Then she'd turned serious, her dark, luminous eyes holding his gaze. He wanted her to take an assignment, but she had decided she wouldn't accept it unless he allowed her to do it her own way. She held up the piece of paper in her hand and he motioned for her to continue. She ticked off the items: a 40-hour work week, a minimum wage, workers' compensation, unemployment compensation, a federal law banning child labor, direct federal aid for unemployment relief, Social Security, a revitalized public employment service, and national health insurance. She watched his eyes to make sure that he was paying attention and understood the implications of each demand. She braced for his response, knowing that he often chose expediency over idealism and was capable of callousness, even of cruelty. The scope of her list was breathtaking. She was proposing a fundamental and radical restructuring of American society with the enactment of historic social welfare and labor laws. To succeed, she would have to overcome opposition from the courts, from business, from conservatives, even from labor unions. Nothing like this has ever been done in the United States before, she said. You know that, don't you? The man sat across from her in his wheelchair, amid the clutter of boxes and rumpled rugs. Soon he would head to Washington, D.C. to be sworn in as the 32nd president of the United States. He would inherit the worst economic crisis in the nation's history. An era of rampant speculation had come to an end. The stock market had collapsed, rendering investments valueless. Banks were shutting down, stripping people of their lifetime savings. About a third of workers were unemployed. Wages were falling. Hundreds of thousands were homeless. Real estate prices had plummeted, and millions of homeowners faced foreclosure. His choice of labor secretary would be one of his most important early decisions. His nominee must understand economic and employment issues, but be equally effective as a coalition builder. He was a handsome man with aquiline features, and he studied the plain, matronly woman sitting before him. No one was more qualified for the job. She knew as much about labor law and administration as anyone in the country. He'd known her for more than 20 years, the last 4 in Albany, where she had worked at his side. He trusted her and knew she would never betray him. But placing a woman in the labor secretary's job would expose him to criticism and ridicule. Her list of proposals would stir heated opposition, even among his loyal supporters. The 8-hour day was a standard plank of the Socialist Party. Unemployment insurance seemed laughably improbable. Direct aid to the unemployed would threaten his campaign pledge of a balanced budget. Still, he said he would back her. It was a job she had prepared for all her life. She had changed her name, her appearance, even her age to make herself a more effective labor advocate. She'd studied how men think so she could better succeed in a man's world. She had spent decades building crucial alliances. Still, she told the president-elect that she needed time to make her decision. The next day, she visited her husband, a patient in a sanitarium. He was having a good day, and he understood when she told him about the job offer. His first impulse was to fret for himself, asking her how this new job might affect him. When she assured him that he could remain where he was and that her weekend visits would continue, he gave his permission. That night in bed, the woman cried in deep wailing sobs that frightened her teenage daughter. She knew the job would change her life forever. She would open herself to constant media scrutiny, harsh judgment from her peers, and public criticism for doing a job a woman had never done before. Yet she knew she must accept the offer. As her grandmother had told her, whenever a door opened to you, you had no choice but to walk through it. The next day, she called Franklin Roosevelt and accepted the offer. Frances Perkins would become the nation's first female Secretary of Labor. Well, we know what happened. The Social Security Act passed in 1935. That gave us unemployment insurance and Social Security. The Fair Labor Standards Act passed in 1938, and it set the standard of a 40-hour work week, a minimum wage, which I'd like to say she had hoped would be a living wage, a ban on child labor, and the concept of overtime pay for workers asked to work long hours. It allows people to work longer hours if they want to and gives them better pay if they want to, but punishes employers financially if they ask for it too often. It's a genius proposal. She was a major supporter of the Federal Housing Administration insurance program that's helped millions of people buy houses. I think about 8 million people in America have FHA insurance right now. About 50 have bought their homes through FHA insurance. And I'd just like to remind you that that's something that put millions of people into homes with indoor plumbing and running water. She was the primary architect of the Civilian Conservation Corps, which put 3 million young men and women to work on state and national parks, reforesting projects and soil erosion. There are so many projects all over the country that were built and improved as a result of the Civilian Conservation Corps. Now, this is something that was FDR's idea, but as he did with many things, he would have a genius idea and then he'd turn to Frances Perkins and say, figure out how to make it happen. And it was an extraordinary thing. Imagine finding a way to mobilize that you could house and feed 3 million, mostly young men, but they tried as hard as they could also to get some female CC camps going too. But she did it by borrowing excess military goods left over from World War I and finding out-of-work military officers who could serve as directors for these programs and help administer it. The CCC program gave young workers about I think $30 to $35 a month, with much of the money going back to their families. So it took young men who might otherwise have been homeless and adrift, maybe have become hobos, and it turned young men who had very little prospects into men who could take enormous pride in what they were doing to help support their entire extended family. It's part of the genius again of the New Deal, is how much of it was built on productive labor and having people take pride in what they do to contribute to the betterment of all. Frances Perkins was also the largest single supporter of the WPA and the PWA programs that gave us all kinds of public work projects. And I'll just give you a few examples. The Lincoln Tunnel, the highway to the Florida Keys, the East Bay Bridge, the approaches to the Golden Gate Bridge, the trails and the roads in Yosemite, the US Mint in San Francisco. And of course, there's everything that she did for the labor movement. She helped draft the rule that gave workers the right to organize, to collectively bargain for better wages and benefits. In 1932, when Frances Perkins became Secretary of Labor, only 5% of workers were unionized. That's about half of the 10% we have unionized now. But by the time she died, about a third of the American workforce was unionized. And that propelled millions of people into the middle class for the first time. And as I said before, there's the other things that she did. That's what she did when she was in her 50s and 60s. I haven't even gotten around to what she did in her 20s, 30s, and 40s. There were a number of really remarkable accomplishments throughout her life. And I think one of the things that I find so fascinating about her, and I think intrigues us all so much, is to realize that there was a person in American history who did so much and who is virtually unknown to most Americans altogether. One of the challenge, I didn't know who Frances Perkins was when I arrived in Washington, D.C. as a young reporter for the Washington Post. That was back in 1988. I was a reporter there for 20 years. I remember when I went by the Frances Perkins Department of Labor and I saw it for the first time, I remember I noted, oh, hey, look, there's something here named after a woman, because I could tell because it was spelled with an E. And there's so little in Washington named after women that it was kind of notable to me even then. And I started to listen for her name and started to be curious about hearing what she did. And over the 20 years that I was a reporter at the Washington Post, and as I reported on a really wide range of economic, social, and political issues, the things that were Frances Perkins' handiwork came up again and again. And when I would go back to say, how did this program get established? Frequently, only someone very old, from my perspective in my 30s, I thought anyone in their 40s or older was extremely old. But, people who were older, who remembered the New Deal and the Truman administration and the Eisenhower era, would often say to me, oh, it's Frances Perkins that did that. And I started to just be amazed at all that she did. We came up with the idea. So I spent about 10 years working on the book. I first started to think about it on a train trip across the country. I began to think about America's labor history and how little we know about it. I was thinking about the social safety net and how it actually had gotten put together. And I began to think that maybe I could write a story that would use one person's life as a way to weave all these diverse things together. And at the time that I started thinking about writing the book, and I think that was must have been about the year about the year 2000. I didn't even realize at that point all the places I was going to find her and all the things she was going to do. If I'd known, I think I would have been too intimidated to try to tackle a book of that scope. And if I'd known how far flung the archives are that hold her papers, I would have run in terror. But as it turned out, I didn't know. And I went across the country on the train thinking about all this. And I drafted a proposal to write a book on this topic. And at the same time, I applied for a fellowship at the Nieman Foundation at Harvard, which would give me a year to focus on all the archives in New England. And that turned out to be wonderful because I got the fellowship. It turned out a remarkable collection of Frances Perkins papers, in addition to all the things that were in Washington, D.C., where I lived, were in New England. And because I was in New England, I also got the wonderful opportunity to meet Frances Perkins' fascinating family, her daughter, Susanna Coggeshall, and her grandson, Tomlin Coggeshall, who I see is one of our listeners and viewers here tonight. So that ended up being enormously fortuitous chain of events. I found that it was a difficult task tracking down all her papers, partially because they were far flung, but also because she'd gone out of her way to cover her tracks. She was a member of the Socialist Party when she was young, and she went far out of her way to conceal that information. In fact, later, when another author was doing a book on papers that had been Socialist Party papers that had been sealed up behind a brick wall to conceal them at New York University, someone saw Frances Perkins' membership card and called to ask her about it. And she said, "I don't know what you're talking about." When the scholar went back to double check, the card was missing. So a lot of the ways that Frances Perkins got things done, she didn't exactly want us to know how she did it, but that doesn't mean anything was done unethically. As a matter of fact, I really think I spent 20 years looking for ways that she had not lived up to my ideals. I spent 20 years, I'm a news reporter. It was my job to find her clay feet. And after 10 years of research, all I could say is that she pretended to be younger than she was, and she pretended she came from a richer family, which is not hard to understand. The New York progressive movement, the Roosevelt family, they were a very affluent family, and she wanted to be able to fit in and mix with the power brokers, and she made herself a bit more elite than she might have been. But overall, across the board, I think one of the things that was really so extraordinary is how much she did that was so extremely ethical. I've recently been reading Robert Caro's series on LBJ, and I think we can all agree that LBJ did some great things, but he did them in a dark way, and he was a dark person. And the thing I can say about Frances Perkins is there aren't ugly secrets. She was an extraordinarily brilliant person. She was very gifted at recognizing people who had enormous potential and finding ways to, you might say, harness them together to get important work done. One of the ways she was able to accomplish so much is she would set a goal for herself, like I explained in that list that I just described in the prologue. She would set out a goal that she wanted to do. She would find out how the best way she could get it done. She'd get it set up. She would get it established so that it was completely secure. I mean, and I want you to just stop and take a second here to give a particular salute to the Social Security system and how really problem-free it is. It's this extraordinary, complicated system, and how problem-free it is because it was set up so well. But what Frances Perkins did with Social Security and with all these other programs she set up is she often allowed other people to take credit for them. And so it meant that in a lot of ways, she didn't get to be in the limelight at the time things happened. But in fact, she was the one who had accomplished it. When we thought of what the title of the book should be, we chose this title. I had actually wanted the book to be called Defender of the Working Man. But there had been concern that by saying the working man did that mean I was excluding women? And I still kind of like that title a lot, but we ended up picking The Woman Behind the New Deal. And then much to our surprise, we found that it was difficult communicating to people what that book was about because everyone assumed, well, there was only one woman involved in the New Deal, right? Eleanor Roosevelt. And so ever since then, I've had the problem with people thinking it's another book about Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt plays a big role in the book, but no, it's not a book about Eleanor Roosevelt. It's a book about the most remarkable progressive in American history, either male or female, and that's Frances Perkins. And I'm really delighted to take your questions, and I want to leave room at the end for a kind of a fun challenge and activity for you in the year ahead.
Okay.
Dawn, do you want to read the questions to me?
Yeah, the best way probably is for you to put your questions in the chat, if you could. I'm happy to do those. Thank you, Kirstin, for your words and outlining your book, but also Frances Perkins' life and how you discovered and shared with the world so much more. And I think at least having followed along from the time when your book was coming out till now, I think I won't give you all the credit, but a fair amount of credit for I think helping to, along with the Perkins Center folks and others, to really bring Frances Perkins into this generation in a powerful way, and I appreciate that. Kurt Meyer, did you have a question? You have come off mute, and I think you were raising your hand.
Yes, I do have a question. My question is whether Frances Perkins, had she been an I Frances rather than an E Frances, would she have been as successful? If she had been a man, perhaps her novelty was one of the keys to her success, but that's a very tentative theory, and I'm interested in your thoughts.
Well, that's very interesting. Well, first of all, her name wasn't even Frances. She was born with the name Fanny, which of course is not an advantageous name. And so she started in her, at about age 20, early 20, she began calling herself Frances. There was a school of thought that having a gender neutral name was better for women, but by calling herself Frances with an E, she could still distinguish herself as a woman. I think that you're raising a really good question and a really good point. I think in a lot of ways there was novelty value. I would also say that she believed that one of the keys to her success was that because she was a woman, she had no hope of political advancement at any time. Anything she got was, she thought, the highest she could ever get. So when she sat down in the cabinet meetings, she was surrounded by men who were all hoping to one day be president themselves. So everything they were doing was through the prism of, I might want to do this, but how will this work out for me politically? Frances Perkins had no illusion that she had any future beyond Secretary of Labor. So if she'd been Frances with an I, she might have been a bit more self-serving, a bit more ambitious. I know I've been watching Biden's cabinet, and I often note to myself, who has the courage to stand up, even if it might hinder their future political ambitions. I'd like to see a lot more people be more outspoken on issues. I think that was one of the things that was good about Frances Perkins is she could be totally in FDR's court. She could tell him what would be best for him because she wasn't looking out for what was going to be best for her.
Terrific response. Thank you. Thank you.
Elliot, thank you for your question in the chat. Others can do that as well. It says, excellent book. You read quite a bit about her magical ability to network and call on old friends. Was there any evidence of her leveraging her old Socialist Party comrades for support for the New Deal or deflect left criticism of the New Deal?
One thing we do know is that Frances Perkins took advantage and made contacts with everyone she met, both friends and enemies. She was really good at reaching across the aisle. She had a big network of Republicans that helped her. The League of Women Voters was a bipartisan organization, so I know that she relied very heavily on a network of progressive women Republicans around the country. A lot of the socialists, I'm sure, that were her friends, were equally, many of them equally shy about flagging what they were doing, especially as the McCarthy era came in. But the group that she relied on the most, that she said gave her the most help over all the years, were her women's suffrage friends. They had been together arm in arm. It's hard for us to imagine today how frightening it was to speak up, a woman to speak up for the right to vote. Men would throw rotten vegetables at people, hurl insults at them. A lot of women ridiculed them or found them embarrassing. And the women's suffrage leaders had to be very brave and had to back each other up. And one of the things I think that Frances Perkins said afterwards, that it was the network of suffrage leaders. Another group that was very important to her, and of course many of them were socialist, was the Settlement House movement. The Settlement House movement, she'd lived at Hull House with Jane Addams off and on when she was a young woman. She was teaching at a college at Ferry Hall, which is now Lake Forest. And so she relied very much on this network of settlement houses. There's a huge network of settlement houses across the country. And Jane Addams, I saw a letter where Jane Addams said, Frances Perkins is one of ours. So that's the other group she comes from. And as far as specifically the socialist, in all the ways that I've mentioned, and of course, when Upton Sinclair wrote his book, The Jungle, he had gotten all the help that he needed from, and explanations, introductions from the settlement house workers in Chicago who were Frances Perkins' friends. So yes, they were directly connected.
Okay, next I have Rick Tuttle.
Thank you. And Ms. Downey, thank you so much for this book. It's a terrific read. I gotten through most of it, and I love your opening. I love how you characterize her. You bring her to life. And I once saw her. I'm out here in Los Angeles. She gave a talk at UCLA years ago in the early middling 60s, came through, and I'm 81 years old, so I have some sense of who she is. Here are two questions. The first woman ever elected to the United States Senate, Senator Hattie Caraway from Arkansas. And I don't see mention in your work of Ms. Perkins having any relationship with Senator Caraway, nor, by the way, have I seen this in biographies and where I've looked with Mrs. Roosevelt and Senator Caraway, who was a very strong, within the context of Arkansas, left progressive Democrat, for example, Huey Longbacker. And she served 2 terms plus in the United States Senate. Did you pick up anything about any not that it would be terribly important to this work, but in terms of Caraway, did you have any sense of a collective of those very few women who were in positions of power? United States Senator, for heaven's sakes. And
absolutely.
Any collective at all?
Oh, absolutely. And one of the things that was really important is that Frances Perkins traveled a lot through the South, explaining the platform of the Democratic Party. When she did, as she went all through the South, she was often hosted by women suffrage leaders who'd been active in the party or been active in their states early on. So there was this very strong network, especially also through the League of Women Voters that did this. I have to say, I have a vague recollection of seeing correspondence with Hattie Caraway, but I can't tell you what it was. And one of the things that's very interesting is I told you when I was researching the book, the book came out in 2009.
Right.
So I was working on it from like 1999 to say 2009. The internet hadn't made the strides that it has made since. So when I was in archives going through old letters, I didn't have the ability, if something was a personal letter and it was, oh, hey, hey, Hattie, how are you doing? Oh, I'm fine. Fanny, what's up? Hope everything's good. Hope Paul's doing better. I didn't know I couldn't tell who people were unless I knew who they were. Whereas now, if I was to do the same job going through correspondence, I'd be there with my laptop and I could Google every name. And so it's interesting because other names have been raised to me over the years with people asking, did I know of correspondence with Frances Perkins? All I can tell you is there are tens of thousands, tens and tens of thousands of letters from Frances Perkins to people and from people in many archival collections. And it would really be, I think there's a future job for someone to do in pulling together a lot of this correspondence. It frequently comes up with issues around the Holocaust because the Immigration and Naturalization section was part of the Labor Department then. And Frances Perkins was known to have brought found ways to usher a lot of people to safety in the United States. But when I would see their names in letters, they'd just be saying, hey, how are you? Thank you. Thanks for your help. I couldn't tell who they were. And I think there's probably an important job to be done in getting a better understanding of intellectuals from Europe, religious people from Europe, and Jews from Europe, other kinds of people who came to who had to flee.
I have another question, but I can defer so others can ask questions, and I'll get back in line for my other question. But thank you.
Thank you, Rick.
Thank you.
I appreciate that. All right, I have one on chat, or several on chat. So one from Chris. Do you think someone like her would get anywhere in today's political environment?
What a good question. Do I think she would get anywhere in today's political environment? Yes, I do. Yes, I do. She was completely devoted to getting things done. She would be an outlier. She would get criticized a lot because she would almost certainly reach across party lines to try to get things accomplished. She would have been one of the people working on the bipartisan infrastructure deal, not one of the people stopping it. So okay. I think there's a very great need for people right now who can find ways to work across the aisle. I don't think she would have been a good tweeter. She was very long-winded, and there's a mean-spirited quality to Twitter that I don't think would have been her natural milieu. And all I can say is congratulations to her.
Okay. From Tomlin, what kind of relationship did FP have with Molly Dewson? Was Ms. Dewson supportive or competitive?
Oh, that's very interesting. The question is about Molly Dewson, who was an important leader of the women's branch of the National Democratic Party. Molly Dewson was able to mobilize a lot of voters, and she was influential for a few years early in the FDR administration. I would say they were friendly to each other, congenial. The letters are congenial, but they weren't friends. I wouldn't say they were friends. Frances Perkins was hard to get to know. She was a little standoffish, and she was a little uncomfortable with the overt politicizing of things. She was more focused on issues and being effective, less of a political figure. I think one of the things that is very interesting is that Molly Dewson was in a long-term committed relationship with another woman. I believe her name was Polly Porter. And certainly Frances Perkins was supportive and understanding and very and encouraging to that relationship. And so from that perspective, I would say they were friendly to each other.
Okay, here's another from the chat. Did Frances Perkins know most or all of the socialists running for the House or Senate before 1933, including my maternal grandfather? This is from Samuel Parnes.
She was very politically active for a long time. She got nominated her first, or she got recommended for her first important public position by Teddy Roosevelt for the Committee on Safety that was investigating the causes of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. So she was very politically active nationally from about 1912. So that means she was very active through all those years. She was also a very strong supporter of the International Labor Organization, which was part of the old League of Nations. And of course, the United States never joined on to the League of Nations, but the International Labor Organization survived, and it had very strong labor union component to it. And in Europe, most of the labor unionists were socialists. So Frances Perkins was definitely very closely connected to global socialism as well. And one of the first things she did when she became Secretary of Labor was to get the United States to join the ILO, which is one of the things that she did kind of quietly but successfully. And then that ended up being very important for the future of the ILO, because the rest of the League of Nations was destroyed by the Nazis in World War II. And the only part that survived was the ILO, which was where the United States was a member, and Frances Perkins negotiated for them to get to safety in Canada. And that was the only part of the old League of Nations to survive and to become later part of the United Nations.
Thank you. There's some chatter in the chat. That's what the chat's for. There's some interesting things here on archives and where they're at. I appreciate those who know for chipping in and answering questions as we go, including links. So check out the chat. Let me get to the next question here from Bob Farrell. What were her views on the exclusions of Black people, exclusions of domestics and agricultural people?
She was very upset about that. One of the first things she did when she became Secretary of Labor was to integrate the cafeteria and the offices of the Labor Department. She did that without making a big show about it, just quietly ordered it, and it was done. She was concerned about labor conditions for all working people. She was very disappointed the Fair Labor Standards Act didn't go as far as she wanted it to go or cover as many people as she wanted it to cover. She was very disappointed in that. But when I went through and explained to you when different things happened, what's important to know is that the Fair Labor Standards Act passed in 1938. And by 1938, FDR has been really damaged by the court packing controversy. And already very great concern is rising about the threat of war, the threat of world war. So the Fair Labor Standards Act wasn't everything that she wanted. This has been an interesting thing that's come up recently. When I first would give talks about this, about Frances Perkins, when the book first came out, people would be, I talk about the Fair Labor Standards Act, but it's become quite a big thing now among academics to talk about the flaws in the Fair Labor Standards Act. And there are flaws in it. The fact is, I believe I may get these numbers a little bit wrong, but as I remember at my most recent time I looked at it, about 8 million people were covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act. I mean, these are people who had who could be able to be asked to work 7 days a week, 16 hours a day, children, about 8 million people got protections for the first time because of the Fair Labor Standards Act. And I remember when I was researching this, I had one elderly man tell me that when the Fair Labor Standards Act passed, that was the first time he'd ever gotten out of work while it was still light. Every time, his whole life had been only getting out of work when it was dark. So about 8 million people were covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act. About 500,000 is the estimate for how many people, domestic workers and farm workers, were excluded. And she felt badly about that. She didn't want that to happen. But it was difficult to get everything they wanted. And it had been her belief throughout her whole life that it's better to get some people protected and get a better life for some than to try to pursue perfection and get nothing for everyone. And I guess you can say that even the people that were excluded after that could have had the opportunity to move into other jobs that would have given them better wages and better and better working conditions. It's just interesting that it's sort of in currency now to talk about the flaws and weaknesses of the New Deal rather than to applaud its successes. And the fact is, the rest of us have to get busy. The Fair Labor Standards Act is undone, and that is what we all have to take responsibility for. We don't have a living wage. As with COVID, as more people work out of the home, we're going to have more children and more teenagers drawn, working in the home. We've got new threats and challenges that we need to stand up to and look at. We have a lot of people who are being exposed to workplace injury, and there's a lot of things that need to be addressed. And that is up to us. It's unfortunate that Frances Perkins back in 1938 didn't get everything. But what I say is, okay, you, let's see you fix it. What can we do?
Right. Well, thank you. That addresses, something that I was considering asking, kind of what would be on Frances Perkins' to-do list, and I think a fair amount of that would be as you described. Let me get one more here. I see you, Rick. I'm going to get to you in a second. From Nina. Can you say something about her education and how it may have shaped her?
Oh, right. Yes. Frances Perkins' education was very important to her. She was president of her class at Mount Holyoke. And Mount Holyoke as a college historically has prepared people. They have now men and women there, but up until recently and through her life, it was a school that was specifically designed to help educate women on the same level as men, in the ways that men could go to school and that women were precluded, and to prepare them for a life of public service and to provide them for a life that would be bigger than themselves and where they would try to make a difference in the world. And after all these years, Mount Holyoke women and men are still doing that. She was president of her class in 1902, and their motto was "Be ye steadfast." Be ye steadfast.
Rick, go right ahead.
I can't resist this, Ms. Downey. My heart, I mentioned I'm in Los Angeles. I fled to the West Coast from New England, Wesleyan University, Middletown, Connecticut. My heart was broken by a series of Mount Holyoke women. I was eager. I was eager. They were steadfast. Oh, they were lovely and accomplished and wonderful. But to a gender-related question, and you mentioned her grandmother, and every sense I have is her grandmother. From your reading, not from anything, and I'm a one-trick pony. I read your work. Terrific. Can you tell us more about her? And I'm particularly interested in the relationship of the great General O.O. Howard, who, and by the way, earlier in the call, one of our great ADA members, Councilman Robert Farrell, who asked you the question about the Fair Labor Standards Act and race and so on, was a freedom rider to Mississippi, and that triggered my sense of it. So it's a compound question, namely the O.O. Howard. You gave us a teaser on that, and a cousin in what sense, and also in the family, and also the lady who was her grandma.
Right. Frances Perkins grew up she's a product of New England. And so she's a product of New England in the ways that people in New England have very long memories about the history of the United States. And her own relatives were very knowledgeable. O.O. Howard was, I think I have to go back, sort of a cousin, and he had been a general in the Civil War. So, she was born in 1880. He had lost his hand in the Civil War, and he came to visit them in Maine, and she actually wrote for him while he would transcribe some of the books that he was working on. He played an important role. He'd actually suffered a lot personally because he was the director of the Freedmen's Bureau and had tried to give freed slaves land and access to capital so that they would be able to build a better life for themselves. And he found it very difficult, and he was accused of being corrupt. And that, as everyone knows, never happened. And many freed Blacks have had many decades of financial hardship. Although Howard had hoped that it would not be like that. So from these family members, she has, imagine that, an older relative who has immediate firsthand memories of the Civil War. She has a grandmother who she's very close to, Cynthia Otis, who she's very close to and who is very encouraging to her and who tells her stories going back much further in history than that. And I really think that's part of the reason Frances Perkins crafts a lot of the economic programs in the way she does, is that the family had lived in the United States for so long, first the colonies and then the United States for so long, that they knew about these boom and bust cycles. And she devised programs that were specifically relevant to the lived experience of her family. Their homestead in Damascotta, Maine, which is a historic landmark now, has been purchased by the Frances Perkins Center. It still has, throughout the property, it's littered with bricks that were used when the family was involved in making bricks that were used in buildings all over New England. So all the things that Frances Perkins experienced in her childhood through her family were all the things that informed her about what was needed by the New Deal, looking toward America's future as well. And I think that's something that she shared very much with both FDR and Eleanor. They both had those very long family histories in America where they'd seen boom and bust cycles, where people prosper and then where people are desperately poor. And they devised systems that would help provide a safety net for people. I think those were some of the things that Frances Perkins learned directly from her grandmother.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rick. I've got a couple more here. Let's see. Was she aware of the works of Charlotta Bass?
I don't know. I'm sorry.
Okay. On to the next one. From Kurt, that was from Bob Farrell. From Kurt Meyer, Department of Labor is not seen today as a major cabinet position. Do you think there's any prospect that this might change in the foreseeable future?
The Secretary of Labor always has the potential to make it an important position. A lot of it is a factor of how outspoken they want to be in terms of helping to set the agenda and highlight the problems. I think we've had a series of labor secretaries who were more political than seeking to be effective. And I could say that across administrations. I hope that our new Secretary of Labor will be very successful, and he certainly has a fabulous labor past and is highly regarded in Boston.
Okay. From Elliot, you hint but don't dwell on her Christianity, which seemed to be Anglo-Catholicism. After the trauma of the Al Smith campaign with its anti-Catholicism, did she decide to stay outside of the Catholic Church because of this anti-Catholic backlash?
Frances Perkins chose the Episcopalian Church, Anglican Episcopalian Church, long before she ever knew Al Smith. And in fact, she was raised as a Congregationalist herself. And in fact, a lot of people who are Congregationalist sort of consider Episcopalianism to be a kind of Catholicism anyway. So it was already anathema to some of her relatives. And it was quite a sort of a brave thing for her to do, to go against generations of congregationalism. She loved the rituals of the Anglican Church, and she was quite devout. She went to a convent in it's an Anglican Episcopalian convent in Catonsville, where she would observe a vow of silence up to 3 days a month. And when I was researching the book, there were some very old nuns who remembered seeing her there. She would be on her hands and knees praying all night while she crafted legislation and thought about solutions to the country's problems. And then they'd see her also at her desk working late into the night. But I was very taken by this description that she was actually on her knees in the dark in front of an altar at the time that at dawn, when people would be coming to clean up the church to get it ready, the chapel to get it ready for the first of the services of the day. She was very devout. She was very offended by anyone being prejudiced against anyone's religious practices. She actually was, there was a rumor circulating that she was in fact Jewish, and she responded with a letter. As the rumor circulated, she put out a public letter and saying she was not Jewish, and if she was Jewish, she would be very proud to tell everyone that she was, but she was not. And she certainly didn't approve of anti-Catholic bias, particularly as it showed up in discrimination against immigrants. Whoop, I lost you.
John, are you muted?
Am I being called up?
Can you still see me? I can't see you. Can you guys
Yes.
see?
Rick Tuttle?
Okay.
Okay, sorry.
Okay. I can't see you anymore, but
Am I,
I think you guys can hear me.
yeah,
We can.
Russell, am I up? Is it
Can
my
you see me?
You're up, Rick. Sorry. You're up, Rick.
Okay, thank you. The relationship, I'm going to start with one word, compassion.
Yes.
And reference to her husband. Your work has rehabilitated her reputation in terms of her relationship with him, who had a series of nervous breakdowns and so on and so forth. What's your take on this in terms of it providing oxygen for her moving forward? Because a lot of what she was about could be thought of through the lens of compassion.
Yes. Well, she was an extremely compassionate person. She had an unusual ability to put herself in someone else's shoes. She met Paul Wilson when she was about 30 and fell in love in what seems to have been pretty much a love match. He was handsome and very intelligent, part of a very exciting mayoral administration in New York City. So it was, they had sort of a glittering circle of artists and aspiring politicians like Robert Moses were in their circle. A number of the Greenwich Village, colorful Greenwich Village figures of the time as well. So there was their marriages started out on a very hopeful note, but he did have a very serious problem of bipolar disorder. And so she had to learn to live with a person who both needed to be supported and needed a lot of help. So she had a lot of compassion for people who had longstanding medical problems that they had to deal with. I've often thought, though, that as much as it was a disadvantage for her to have a husband who was ill, in a sense, it also freed her to pursue her career in a way that she wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. When she and Paul first got married, she quit working out of the home. She did different volunteer things, but she quit working at home. And it was, I think that having a husband who was disabled gave her cover to be able to keep working in the public and in a highly paid job too.
Okay. Thank you, Kirstin. Check out the chat here for as we're closing up. I'm gonna thank all of you for joining us. Do check out Kirstin's book. You've seen the links multiple times. I hope you can get a copy of it. Certainly go to KirstinDowney.com to find out more about her work. And of course, go to FrancesPerkinsCenter.org as well. And dig deep into that wonderful project and all of the programs and things that they have there. And of course, keep supporting ADA in our 75th year, adaction.org. Kirstin has the final word.
Oh, Dawn, yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry, Dawn. I'm sorry. I wanted to say one thing, and that was that I wanted to mention one more thing at the end, and I'll just try to do it quickly. But I just thought, here as we celebrate, can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Okay.
Here as we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the ADA, it's great. I wanted, Dawn highlighted to me some of the places that people were going to be joining us from tonight. And so I wanted to think about places that you could go in your own state to celebrate the New Deal. And it happened. And so I looked up a lot of the things that had happened in the Civilian Conservation Corps and how they affected individual states. So I'm going to try to go through a couple of these real quick. If you're from Arkansas, I'd really suggest you go visit Crowley's Ridge State Park and Mount Nebo State Park, which were where the infrastructure was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps. Mount Nebo State Park is particularly interesting because it's on the Cherokee Trail of Tears. People in Southern California might want to go to the La Purísima Mission reconstruction in Lompoc, but also many other national parks or state parks have, in California, have CCC infrastructure. In Hawaii, I'd suggest you go on the trails at the Hawaii Volcanoes Park, built by the Civilian Conservation Corps. In Chicago, if you're from Chicago, in Illinois, it was a huge effort. There were 92,000 men put to work. They planted 60 million trees. They laid 1,000 miles of trail. And they did the reconstruction of the Lincoln Log Cabin site. So that's a place you could actually go to celebrate the New Deal. Iowa has 8 historical state parks with features built by the CCC, including Backbone, which is Iowa's first state park. It even has a CCC museum. And Beeds Lake has a unique stone spillway built by the CCC. If you're in North Carolina, take a ride along the Blue Ridge Parkway. CCC men helped build it. In New Jersey, you could go to Jenny Jump State Forest in Hope or the Penn State Forest in New Gretna. If you're in New Mexico, take a ride over to the Bandelier National Monument because the CCC built the first road to that and 31 structures there. And that they opened the park up to visitors in that way that have allowed many thousands of people to see petroglyphs and clay cave dwellings that are signs of life there for 11,000 years. Now in New York, there's one of the CCC camps for women, and it was at Bear Mountain State Park. They called it Camp Jane Addams. For Western, Central, and Southeast Pennsylvania, those of you who are from Pennsylvania, all I can tell you is there are dozens of CCC camps. There's a printable map online showing where they are. They're everywhere. And there's 2 CCC museums, one at Parker Dam State Park and the other at Promised Land State Park. And in Wisconsin, those of you who are from Wisconsin, I'd say head over to Devil's Lake State Park, where there's a historical marker about the CCC. And in fact, in this year where we're all so restricted in things we can do indoors, COVID gives us a great excuse to look for things in the outdoors. And I've suggested some things that you can go to see Frances Perkins' handiwork in your own state.
Again, thank you, Kirstin. And to all of you for joining us, wonderful event and discussion. Thank you for joining us to celebrate 88th, 75th birthday. And we look forward to continuing to work with all of you in this important year and the years to come. As we're saying as part of our celebration, the best is yet to come, and that's because of you. Thank you all, and good night.